So good evening, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm the head of the Department of China Studies, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you tonight the China Studies series of China Talks for 2016. We ran these. There's seats up here, please. Come and join us. We ran a series of China Talks last year. They were quite successful, and we decided to do the same again this year. The talks are given all by members of staff in the China Studies Department. There's a program which UMC have amazingly produced, and the program is on the back. They're free, but if you want to give donations, I'll give you my Swiss bank account later. I have drawn the short straw of presenting the very first one tonight on middle-class China, as you can see. I'm a bit embarrassed, actually, about doing this because middle-class China is really one of the major research projects of almost everybody in the Department of China Studies. And in particular, two of my colleagues, Ying Miao and Bei Tang, have books coming out later this year on the topic. So we can sign you up to buy copies of those as well. The hardback comes at a generous 5% discount. So I want to talk anyhow about middle-class China. So before I do, I thought it was wise to give you a little kind of reality check, a message from our sponsor. We live in a country, China is a country, where you wouldn't really expect middle-classness to be a virtue, let alone discussed. After all, Communist Party states, Marxism, Leninism, what's the middle class doing in a Communist Party state? The notion of Marxism is that class conflict is polarized between whoever is the ruling class at the moment and whoever is the subordinate class at the moment. What's the middle class doing? Usually not very much. And as you probably know from your understanding of Marx and Weber, they're probably being torn apart by the dominant class and the subordinate class and their class conflict. So we have a real puzzle here. How come all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but since 2002, middle-classness has been one of the most important socio-political movements in China and constantly debated by politicians, in the media, in consumption, in everywhere. So what is going on here? And so, one of the answers, of course, is a clue, the China dream. Keep it in mind, we'll come back to it. It's certainly the case that everywhere you go, there are signs these days of the middle class. This is a poster from Xi'an Airport, of all places, but there you go. Professor Xi sent me to Xi'an, so I used the opportunity to take photographs of the middle class. You can see this is a post office savings bank poster, but you can see even if you don't understand Chinese, you can get the symbolism of what's going on here. Here's a happy young married couple who go on holidays, palm trees. They have a car. They're building their house on a new estate, you can see. And that looks just like West Australia to me. And they have a young daughter, very important, who's going to university, not just any kind of high school. And she's learnt to play the violin, and so on and so forth, and they're saving for it, right? Now, these are things that anywhere in the world you would say to you, please, there are some seats here if you would like to come and sit down. 3 seats with your names on. Please, do come and sit down. Anywhere in the world, these things would be regarded as middle class. And indeed, since 2002, in China, as I've said, there is a heavy discourse about the importance of the middle class. The middle class is the focus of social policy. What is going on here is to build a stable society based around a big middle class who will guarantee consumption, stability, political stability, security for everybody, a rapidly increasing standard of living, and so on and so forth. You may say, why did Lu Shui, whose name is down the bottom there, who is the author of this, why did Lu Shui, first of all, who was Lu Shui? So Lu Shui is now dead, unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago, but he was the director of the Institute of Sociology at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Social science, as you know, in China, doesn't mean looking at society and coming up with theories about why things work the way they do. Social science in China means giving advice to government. And that's what the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences does, primarily. I mean, they have some very good social scientists who do the other stuff as well, but primarily they exist and are funded to exist to give advice to government. So, in 2002, when Jiang Zemin, at his valedictory speech at the party congress, said, probably not in all innocence, we have rich people, we have poor people, but we don't have a big enough middle people, middle class, middle stratum. This was the signal for people, hello, this was the, you don't have to hunch up, you know, there's no camera down there. I'm real, I'm not a simulacrum, not yet anyhow. When he said that, people like Liu Shuiyi didn't need being told by the Politburo Standing Committee to go away and say, yes, let's find out how the middle class works. Let's find out why the middle class is important. Let's build a middle class. And they did. They did just that. And that's why Liu Shuiyi is talking in these terms. And indeed, both he and subsequently other people almost immediately came up with targets for the growth of the middle class that was to be attained within a very short period of time. By 2010, it was supposed, which is already 6 years ago, my goodness, it was supposed to be 40% of the workforce. By 2020, 55%. And then there are some other details that later people added as well. So we have target. Not only do we have the notion that everybody has to grow into the middle class, but we have targets for it. You get some really interesting things that come out in the middle of the 2000s by people wanting to encourage the growth of the middle class. I mean, for a social scientist working on anywhere else in the world, to have the Chinese Police Academy tell you that the middle class is the political force necessary for stability would raise a smile, but in China it doesn't, of course. And then you have notions developing the theory of the middle class from other people at CAS, like the goal of an olive-shaped society. The goal of an olive-shaped society. Do you know what this refers to? I'll tell you, in case you don't. So sociologists have always said that society is shaped in terms of status, wealth, and political power in terms of a pyramid. A few people have a little power and wealth and status, and a lot of people have very little. And people have often talked about how can we reverse it and have more people with wealth and very few people who are poor. That's the ideal goal for many modernization theorists. But as you'll find out in a minute, and as you may even already know, there are theorists in America in particular who say, no, 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 what you need to go for is an olive-shaped society. A few people who have wealth, a few people who are poor, but the majority of people are in the middle. You may well ask, how do you measure it? And that's the real question, but we'll come on to that in a minute. So here's some of the middle class at play. This is actually Maple Tree Bridge in Suzhou, but never mind. So here are the questions that spring to my mind when I see these images, when I start thinking about the China dream and all that stuff. Who are we actually talking about in sociological terms? How are they identified? How do they identify themselves? What do middle class people want? And what will the growth of a middle class do for China? What middle class people want is actually raised always by social scientists as an important question, particularly since Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History in the late 80s, early 90s. Because, as we all know, in inverted commas, if you have a middle class, you have a democracy. And because that's what middle class people want. And democracy is a good thing. Why? Do you know why democracy is a good thing? Because democracies never go to war with each other. And so you're wondering why I'm saying that. Democracies go to war only with non-democracies. It's okay to invade Iraq. It's not okay to invade Europe or wherever. So whatever. Anyhow, the point of this is there is a link that's seen in all the theories and all the writings about the middle class that if you have a middle class, you will have a liberal democracy. That's what's assumed. So the question then, of course, you would ask me, I'm sure, is if the target for 2010 was 40% in China to be middle class, how come China isn't yet a democracy? Might be the theory is a little wrong. Oh, this is again the middle class at play. This is Qingdao. If you're new to China and you've never seen this, you will see it everywhere. All you have to do is go any day of the week, go over the road to the park near the church. What's it called? I've forgotten the name of the church. Where? Yeah, just south of Renailu. Anyhow, people get their photos taken all the time. This, of course, was not there, but never mind. Now, my answers to the questions I just posed you are as follows. Actually, there isn't a middle class. There are several middle classes. They are much more limited in size than you think. And just to give you a figure to start off with, roughly 12% of the Chinese population are middle class and no more, rather than 20, 10, 40% or anything like that. Middle class is a designation. It's an aspiration which includes two things. One is it masks the difference between upper class and middle class. The other is it encourages people to become middle class. And in fact, that's the real importance of the notion of the middle class and the middle class dream. It's to encourage people to be consumers, to spend, to act and perform like other middle class people without necessarily having the wealth, status and power which go with it. There is a middle class though, and we won't, towards the end, I won't run away from telling you that there really is a middle class. But that middle class, asking the answer to the question, what do they want? They don't want regime change. That would be a mistake to think that. But they do want a fair regime. And that's really part of the answer to that question. So we'll come back to that. Oh, yes, this is just to demonstrate to you. This is a recent picture in Beijing. It's to demonstrate to you that wealth doesn't necessarily lead to taste. It's a real building, I'm afraid to say. Okay, so let's backtrack a little and just have a quick sociology lesson about what middle class really is. Or isn't, because of course middle class doesn't have to be anything, any more than the notion of class has to be anything specific. There has been a historical development in the use of the term middle class. The original middle class were the middle class in Northwest Europe in the first half of the 19th century, who were middle because they were in between the court and the burghers, the townspeople. They were the new upcoming bourgeoisie, owners of capital. You know, people use the term bourgeoisie these days to refer to your parents. They don't, middle-class parents. But that's not what the original bourgeoisie were. And that's not what the original middle class were. Marx and Weber, who come along with their notions of class in the middle of the 19th century, had both completely different views of the middle class to each other, and also to that original notion of the middle class as the bourgeoisie. For a start, as I just said before, for Marx, the notion of middle class was irrelevant. I mean, why would you bother about a middle class if you're preaching a doctrine of class conflict? There was no role for the middle class in Marx, very little. For Weber, who, by the way, had almost the same notion of class as Marx, I mean, many people these days would like to oppose Marx and Weber, but that would be false, but that's a different argument. But for Weber, the middle class was a residual category. He got left with, Weber was in many ways a better Marxist than Marx, and he got left by saying the middle class is anything who isn't the upper class or the subordinate class. So peasants, teachers, school teachers in particular, policemen, they were all middle class, things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as being middle class at all. Now, of course, as society in Europe in particular, but also in North America, developed in the second half of the 19th century, you get the development of capitalism, the development of industrial society, and with that, you get a completely different spin on the old bourgeoisie. Remember, the original middle-class bourgeoisie of the early 19th century owned capital as well as managing it. But by the end of the 19th century, you begin to get owners who don't actually own things necessarily on their own. They have share companies. You get bigger enterprises. You get the need for managers and professionals. And from the 19th into the 20th century, you get the development of both professionals and both a professional and a managerial middle class. managers who manage enterprises, for the owners, who are not themselves, of course, middle class, they're upper class, and professionals who run them, like, of course, lawyers and well-known people like that, but also, of course, important people who help the workforce develop, like doctors and hospitals and schools and so on. So by the start of the Second World War, you have what's called, by some people, the managerial revolution, the emergence of a managerial class, who are very definitely a middle class, a part of the middle class. After the Second World War, you get notions in American sociology of these kinds of people. It's very vague, but that's the language that's used. These kinds of people, meaning people who have real disposable income, who are comfortably well off, who can afford to do things like, shock, horror, have holidays. I mean, I know you will find this difficult to believe, but once upon a time, people didn't have holidays, or didn't get paid for annual leave, or didn't even own their own house, or even the possibility of owning their own house, unless they were upper class or upper middle class. But by the middle of the 20th century, that had started to change, of course. You get then, particularly in American sociology, you get with the development of a notion of a leisure class, a comfortably well-off class, you get the notion of the middle class by income, and with the development of American society, you get the notion that the middle class is actually the ruling class in America. Now, there are many, many progressive sociologists in America from the late 1960s, early 70s onwards, who said, well, that's just nonsense. They may be a growing middle class, but they're just living out the dream, and in fact it's the ruling class who are taking the majority of the benefits from society. But the important thing about this, and it's important in the Chinese context too, is that the goal of a middle class becomes, in that kind of society, the universalizing class. That is what the Chinese Police Academy was meaning when they said the middle class in China, if you grow it, will become a force for harmony. It's like you've moved from the proletariat being the ruling, universalizing class, to the middle class being the universalizing class. It's a logical argument. Whether it's true or not is a different thing. Oh, we've lost my thing. Oh, I wonder if this is Mr. Xi Jinping. Nope. Oh, yes. Okay. Here we go. Okay, now, for a long time, Marxist and Weberian sociologists could not agree about the class structure of all societies. In fact, they had very different views. But round about 1997, all that changed. A prominent Weberian, Anthony Giddens, and a prominent Marxist, Eric Olin Wright, agreed that all societies can be seen in terms of three classes: dominant class, intermediate class, and subordinate class, and that within those three classes there are different subsets. And what's important about understanding societies is how those classes interact. And that's what makes the difference between the societies, not whether they're proletarian-based or bourgeois-based. And that leads to a third understanding, the third of those three contemporary usages on the right there, which is that the middle class is the intermediate class. It's not the dominant class who owns power and wealth. It's not those who rule, who have their class position by virtue of their manual labor, but it's the class that has knowledge, skills, experience, and expertise, and that's what gives them their position of wealth, status, and power in society. So when I talk about middle class, I always talk about the intermediate class. But you can understand that also at the same time there are other people who talk about the middle class as the majority and the middle class as middle income. And even in China, when people are talking about the middle class, there's a confusion between the middle class as middle income, which is what the National Bureau of Statistics talks about, and middle class as majority, of course, but also in terms of the professional and managerial middle class. So, a very quick rundown. And that's a middle class shopping centre in North China. Now, Cass comes along in 2002 with this kind of political imperative. We have to find the middle class. We also, of course, we being Cass, I'm not Cass, but I'm just talking as if I were, please forgive me, Lu Shui gets his group of sociologists together, and they say, well, how are we going to find the middle class? First of all, they have to decide how they're going to find class. This is a society, this is a polity, which has had a major problem with class since 1956. In 1956, Deng Xiaoping got up at the Eighth Party Congress and said, class is no longer relevant in China because we have socialized the means of production, which was the old Marxist-Leninist view of what class should be. And indeed they had. There was no private ownership in China after September 1956. Not in a political economy sense anyhow. I mean, you could own a train set or a matchstick or something like that, but not in a productive sense. So Cass had then a real problem. They had to decide, how are we going to redefine class, and then how will that help us find the middle class? So what they did was they said, well, let's learn from Eric Olin Wright and Anthony Giddens. They actually explicitly said that and did it. And they took the three of those four criteria for the definition of class from the works of Giddens and Eric Olin Wright. Means of production, yes, classic. Position in the authority structure, which comes from Eric Olin Wright's work on class in the 1980s and 1990s, and the possession of skills and expertise, which comes from the work of Anthony Giddens. And then, because of course it has to be class with Chinese characteristics, they added that cadres inside the system or outside the system might also, in other words, inside the system or outside the system, might be a part of the determination of the class of an individual. If you were inside the system, you would be one class. If you were outside, you would be another. Now, you might ask then, what does that then do for people? And the answer is this. They recalculated all the classes that they now came up with, all the class structure of China going back to 1949, based on these new criteria that they were coming up with, and based on their own survey work, both historical and contemporary. And they came up with this class structure, which had, if I remember correctly, 10 categories of class on the left. Now, you will say immediately, but that's very confusing, because that's not class by ideology. This is not, where's the working class? You know, where's the middle class? Where's the ruling class in all this? And the answer is they're not there, obviously. And particularly they're not there when you try to find the middle class. You could say to yourself, as we will do in a minute, some of these statistics, some of these classes that were identified by Lu Shui and Cass suggest to me the middle class. After all, managers, yes. Professionals, yes. Some kinds of office workers, yes, but not by any means all kinds of office workers. I mean, we're talking here about differences in wealth, status, and political power, authority, you know. I'm scared of my departmental secretary, but she's not part of the dominant class. I'm afraid she's not. It would be nice if she were. We'd have a better department. But that's the way it goes, or better university anyhow. Business owners, yes. Private business owners, private entrepreneurs. But there's a problem here. What's an individual business owner in China? It comes up the table quite high in the Cass ranking, but what's in it? Do you know what it is? I'll tell you what it is. Lots and lots, not everybody, but almost everybody. Lots and lots of people were thrown out of work by the reorganization of the state sector of the economy. They didn't have any work, so what do? They go and they do things as individual businesses. They become a barber, or they make pancakes on the street, or they sell food, or they do all that kind of stuff. It's a kind of informal economy, certainly outside the formal economy, the formal supported economy, and they all count as individual business owners. Huge number of them. You wouldn't call those people middle class people, not by any stretch of the imagination, not in terms of wealth, status and power. Okay, we'll come back to this in a minute. So, we have a problem with numbers to try and identify the middle class. First of all, the major problem is there's no relationship between the 10 strata and how the middle class are defined. In fact, on one occasion, Lu Shui, very early on, when asked what was the relationship between these two things, Lu Shui said, any class except the unemployed could be part of the middle class. Well, I suppose in a general kind of way that might be true. but it doesn't very much help the analysis. If everything is in a class, then nothing is in a class, really. And then if you have a look at the numbers, you know, we've been told that the targets that are going to be reached are quite high, that half the population plus is going to be middle class in a couple of years' time. But look at the numbers, look at the growth patterns. It's true that professional and technical personnel have grown quite dramatically in this period, but that's still only 6%. The big numbers which have to grow if the middle class is going to get to be more than half the population are, I've got it right here, are these down here. And whilst people have moved out of agriculture, they haven't moved out and the industrial working class hasn't decreased enough to make these areas here anything more than just a diversification of the subordinate classes. So the numbers that are being talked about really just don't add up. And frankly speaking, future growth to the percentage that's being talked about by Lu Shui is impossible, given the structural constraints of the Chinese political economy. Think of one thing. Think of household registration. People who live in the countryside, who have rural household registration, cannot become middle-class people. They can become rural, a kind of rural middle class, but they only in terms of wealth, not in terms of status, not in terms of political power. I mean, you only have to go to a housing estate or a series of housing estates in any major Chinese city. Each housing estate is severely constrained by its class position. I'll give you an anecdote just to explain this quite clearly. I was thinking, I had a rush of blood to my wallet on one occasion and was thinking of buying a house in North China. So I got a friend of mine's mother to take me round some housing estates in Taihang, in the Taihang Mountains, where I wanted to live, in a place called Changzhou, which is one of my favorite cities in China. You've probably never heard of it. It's very famous though, because it's the only city during that the communists controlled during the Sino-Japanese War. Leaving that aside for the moment, I went there, and she showed me. I mean, she'd studied there. There's a famous medical college there, and she'd studied there. That's why she took me. And she showed me some very nice housing estates, and they were all middle class or upper middle class housing estates. And we're walking past a new housing estate, which was in between two other housing. I said, "Oh, why don't we go in here? They're selling." And she turned on me. She looked down her nose and she said, "You couldn't possibly go in there. That's for people who've come off the land." So there's a very definite status consciousness here, and it's quite. If you've lived in China for any time at all, you'll know it's quite much. So household registration is one problem, but then there are two other problems about the growth of the middle class in the way that's required by the discourse. One is that actually growth is very concentrated in a few particular areas in China, or rather the wealth is. We live here in one of the richest parts not only of China but actually of the world. Are any of you here from England? Yes. This area here has a higher GDP per capita than the UK. Go and tell that to Theresa May or whatever her name is. Right? I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it? My colleague at Nanjing University, Zhou Xiaohong, let me just backtrack a second. National Bureau of Statistics calculates that the middle class starts now at about 80,000 renminbi income a year. 15% of the population earns 80,000 or more. So that's where the middle class starts. Middle class and upper class above it. 15%. My colleague at Nanjing University, Zhou Xiang, calculates that 68% of this area come into that category. It's a lot of people. It's still a lot of people, but it's only in this area. The country as a whole isn't like this. If you go out west, you go to Gansu, Qinghai, other places, Shanxi, it's not like that. It's very different. Oh, there's a lass there from Gansu, she'll tell you, from Qingyang, right? True, yeah, exactly. So the interior, there's a regional development problem. And then there's another thing, tax. There's no tax. I mean, there is tax, but it's not a redistributive tax system. The one thing you need if you're going to grow your middle class, and this is the experience of Northwest Europe, is you need a redistributive tax system. You need to be able to, and you need health and welfare to support consumption, but to do that you need tax. And without that you won't have people with the spending power who can go out and buy. I know the English like to think that their welfare system has been run down over the last few years, and it has, there's no question about it. But at the same time, it's much better than anything here. You know, here not being Suzhou, I'd go into a hospital here any day. I wouldn't go into a hospital any day in Gansu or Qinghai. Well, I would go in, but I'd walk straight through. All right. So we're left with this problem, a very interesting problem that I don't want to dwell on too much, but how many people actually are the middle class? I said that the National Bureau of Statistics give you a figure for the middle class, but of course they're only working on income. They're not working on anything else. Income is not wealth, and wealth is not status, nor is it political power. And all three of those things together have to be how you define in some way class and the middle class. So how do we do it? Well, here's some examples of what people have tried to do over a period of time in different ways. And you can see basically that nobody can agree, and the numbers are all over the place, but for one thing. They've used the figure 60,000 keeps cropping up. Well, the reason the figure 60,000 keeps cropping up is that until last year, the National Bureau of Statistics said that the middle class started at 60,000. They've revised it upwards to 80,000 last year. But that's the reason that happens. And basically my conclusion from this is to say to you, forget trying to analyze it. This is not about numbers. This is really about how you talk about things, how you encourage consumption and stuff like that. We'll come back to that in a minute. Just want to, this is quite interesting numbers thing which I just like to throw in. So I'll just tell you about this before we move on. The reason I do this is to demonstrate to you that not only are the numbers all over the place, but actually you shouldn't even think in terms of any statistical rigor when trying to examine or analyze the income or wealth of China, because it doesn't work. And here's a reason why it doesn't work. So, in 2008, to buy a motor car cost an average 100,000 Chinese dollars. To run a motor car cost an annual 20,000, quite reasonable, altogether 120,000. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, only 20%, only the top 20%, or if you take the top 20% rather, of income, only the average was only 89,000, income of 89,000 per household, and yet you needed a couple of 100,000 to run a car. Do you have any idea what car ownership was at that time? 19%. Okay? So something's wrong, isn't it? Because there ain't enough money there. The answer, of course, is that the National Bureau of Statistics calculation of income is way out, either by a quarter or a third, as indeed is GDP. NERI, which is the National Economic Research Institute of the State Council, by the way, not just any old body out there, estimated that actually the top 20% by income was 248,000, which perhaps explains how people can afford cars, almost, but not quite. In fact, there have been a series of studies of what we call hidden income in China over time, which show quite clearly that there is a difference between National Bureau, official statistics on income, and what real income is. And here's some examples. Some of these are done by bodies within China on their own, and some in conjunction with other agencies around the world. I can tell you about the detail if you're interested. But here's a very interesting consequence of this. How is this hidden income distributed? Is it evenly distributed amongst all income groups? And the answer, of course, is no. The richest 10% get 62.5% of the hidden income. Almost all the hidden income is in the top 20%. It's one of those, you know, it's a bit like that 1920s song, "The rich get rich and the poor have children." Oh, if you read Chinese, this is a fantastic picture. I've been coming to China for a long time, since the Cultural Revolution. And the notion that you could have a shop which was called leisure clothes for the aristocracy has always struck me as being quite amusing. But, you know, I'm just old-fashioned. Okay, so we end up then with some middle-class representations moving away from the numbers, which perhaps make a bit more sense. I've mentioned Lu Shui-yi to you before, but Li Chunling is somebody who is to be taken very seriously. Li Chunling was originally, and it still is actually, part of the group at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences that came up with the class definitions and the analysis that was pioneered by Lu Shui. And she and I had this discussion for over a couple of years. I got quite angry, and she, being Li Chunling, remained very calm. She's about this small and very fiery, very nice. And she kept saying to me, no, you don't understand. The capitalists cannot be part of the ruling class in China. They have to be part of the middle class. Well, my background is I did Marxist political economics at Beida during the Cultural Revolution, so I'm not interested in that. I think that can't be right. And I'm arguing with her and saying, no, capitalists, people who run capitalist enterprise, have to be part of the dominant class. No, she said, they're part of the middle class. Oh, I couldn't understand it for ages. She's won me round. And the reason she's won me round is this. This state does not run for the benefit of capitalists. There are capitalists, yes, people who have capitalist enterprises and go out and do capitalist things. But it's not a capitalist state. The state is actually, the capitalists are actually subservient to the state. They are only allowed to run their businesses so long as the party state allows them. And in that sense, the capitalists are part of the middle class. And it's an argument which I have now accepted. So under socialism, whatever variety of socialism you want to call China, they are the capitalists may exist, but they're not power holders in the same way. Of course, they administer, they exercise huge authority. They're in bed with the party state, no question. But they don't determine what's going to be even their future, let alone other people's. Zhou Xiaohong, my colleague at Nanjing, made a very clever observation a few years ago, which was actually this was talking about the middle class desire to have democracy or something like that, I mean, whether they might even be pushing in that direction. He said, if you do that, and he's written this is not just an observation to me, he said, if you think that the middle class in China is going for democracy, you've got it all wrong. They're not interested in politics, they're interested in buying and consumption and lifestyle. He called them the vanguard of consumption and the rearguard of politics. I think that's a little harsh, for a reason I'll tell you in a minute, but that's what he said. So, if the middle class is not really a class, or even a series of classes, well, it's a series of classes, but it's not the phenomena we've been led to believe it is, and it's difficult to measure. It is clearly more about lifestyle, clearly. I mean, indeed, one might even argue, and people have done about America, that the middle class dream in America is about lifestyle, not about politics or authority. And here it would certainly seem to be. There are some things which seem to be lifestyle middle class. Owning a car, yeah, we've dealt with that. Speaking a foreign language, having advanced technology, eating out, shopping, all those kinds of things. Playing golf, unfortunately. What a waste of a good walk. There are three things I've never done in my life. Golfing, fishing, and sailing. And I hope to God I never do before I die. Here's an interesting picture of a middle-class activity. It's one of those new caffoodle dogs, whatever they're called. But note very carefully what it's wearing. Bloody shoes! How can a dog wear shoes, I ask you? Okay. There have been some very interesting studies done by companies like Boston Consulting and so on, McKinsey's, where they've looked at the consumption patterns of people according to their income. And they find that there are thresholds in consumption in income where your consumption changes. So they have a better idea of who's middle class, or what they call middle class, who's upper class, who's middle class, and who's subordinate class. And this is taken from one of those studies and shows what they do, the kinds of ways in which at a certain income level your consumption pattern gets changed. Most of this is convincing, except for this down here, yogurt. Yogurt, this being, this is the lower classes, the middle class, the upper classes, but yogurt, no. I mean, anybody who's lived in China, anybody who's lived in China any time at all knows that yogurt has been on the streets of Beijing and northern China for years. Everybody used to eat it. It was a poor person's thing. It's not. Yeah. I think what this must be is a kind of error in categorization. I think this must be fruit-flavored yogurt or something like that, red date yogurt or chocolate yogurt or Nutella yogurt or something, because that can't be real. But everything else does kind of make sense. Oh, well, there's a real picture of the rich. Anybody here from England? Yeah, we've done this already. So you know what a Bentley is, yeah? Rich car. How about that? The number plate costs more than the car, because it, in the Chinese numbers, whatever you want to call it, geomancy, that has a meaning about, I'm going to be lucky and I'll buy all the best cars, that kind of stuff. Now, there are some things about consumption in China which are different, and even different for the middle class compared to the rest of the country, rest of the world. Perhaps the most important is branding. Show an Australian two goods made in, say, a famous factory, one which has the brand on and one which doesn't at 10% of the price. The Australian will always buy the unbranded good. Always, no question. Get a good deal, mate. Chinese are not like that. Chinese will only buy the brand, and not only will they only buy the brand, but they'll go out of their way not to buy the brand being sold in China. I had a young research assistant last year who said to me, please bring me back a Mac PowerBook from Australia when you're there. I said, why? It's the same price. No, it will be better. And she was most insistent. And I did it because I'm a kind-hearted idiot. But it's bullshit. It's total bullshit. There's no difference between the Mac here and the Mac. If you bought something that wasn't a real Mac, it was a fake Mac, yeah, sure. But if you go to a Mac shop, you buy a Mac, that's it. But that's the way it goes. You see the comparative figures for branding elsewhere, 30% in USA, 90% in Europe. Clearly, what's at risk here, like with the MacBook story, is that branding is an indicator of quality assurance. You can understand that. We've had some real food scares, in particular in China, in the last 10 years. Brands are important for baby products, luxury goods and so on, and not so for home products and that kind of thing. And foreign brands come in for the kind of real lifestyle stuff, like when you go to the gym and you buy your trainers and all that kind of stuff. And they don't come into it so much for white goods and televisions, where, of course, it would be difficult to go for a foreign brand, since most of the rest of the world buys Chinese televisions and washing machines anyhow. Kind of makes sense. Oh, what a this is one of my favorite pictures. This is a magazine. This is a magazine that exists. It's real. I didn't make it up. It's Chinese, and it's called Trading Up, the magazine for the high class. This is the single most middle-class product you will ever come across. What? It says magazine for the high class. The upper class never say, we want a magazine. The upper class would run a mile rather than call. How can you tell if somebody's upper class? Do you know? How can you tell if somebody's middle class, by the way? Well, let me tell you something. Surveys over the last 25 years in China. You go to people and you say, are you middle class? Everybody says, no, we're working class. Right? Always. Go and ask them, what class are you? What do they say? They say, we're middle class. 2/3 of every survey ever done over the last 25 years. 2/3. So there's a disjuncture there. What do upper class people all over the world always say? You're looking uneasy. No, you're okay? Good. I thought I was stepping on toes here. Go up to somebody who's upper class and say to them, what class are you? And do you know what they say? I'm upper middle class. It's a giveaway. Anybody who claims to be upper middle class isn't. They're part of the dominant class. Oh, Gesundheit. They're part of the ruling class, always. Anyhow, this magazine is fantastically aspirational and says it all. She's actually Chinese, but doing her best not to look it. The adverts inside are consumer heaven. You know, really, you can pig out on it if you're a consumeree. Okay, so let's come on then finally to what middle class people want, other than consumption. Because there is a political message in the middle class, but it's not the political message about democracy. As I say, I think we can identify about 12% of the population as being middle class. That's still substantial, you know, it's a big population. It's 12% would be 150 million roughly. 3% would be, you could count as dominant class, 12% middle class, and the rest subordinate classes of various kinds. In the middle class, you have officials, you have managers, you have professionals, you have business people. So people have asked these people, what do you want, about various things. Perhaps the most interesting one I've ever seen, survey I've ever seen, or analysis I've ever seen, was undertaken by John Unger and our own Bei Tang, who's standing at the back of the room there. They went and asked university teachers how they felt about regime change. I mean, amongst other things. You may remember that in the 1980s, university teachers tended to become radicalized, clearly. They played a role in '89 and all that kind of stuff. Not all of them, and not on a big... It was understandable too, by the way. In the 1980s, there was rapid inflation. Prices went up, particularly for food. And university teachers' salaries did not go up. Quite dramatically, did go up. I mean, one used to meet, by the late 1980s, early 1990s, one used to meet lots and lots of university teachers who were having to take double jobs because they just didn't have enough money. So you would think, you know, possibly from the experience of other countries over time, that, you know, the young lecturers would be the ones on the barricades wanting democracy and so. No, got to think of it. The party is not stupid. The party knew that as a result of '89, it had to do things, not least about its university students and its university staff. The students, it sent to military training. That'll do it every time. And gave them an extra year of education. But the staff, well, what do you think they did? Gave them better conditions. Raised their salaries. Allowed them to buy their own houses. Allowed them to buy second houses. You know, definitely not on these days. Second houses which could be rented out in the market. All those kinds of things. And by the time John and Bebe came to do their survey, there were some people, academics, who said, yes, we need regime change. And I've had conversations with a few, no names, we're on film, but I've had conversations with a few Chinese academics who've said, yes, it would be better if China was a liberal democracy, and even some who've said, we want change and we want it now. But on the whole, not. On the whole, not. On the whole, the academics have bitten the sugar-coated bullets of the bourgeoisie and are quite happy to be bought off. There's actually a structural reason why this may also be the case. As you probably know, China's universities have expanded dramatically since 1998. There are now twice as many teachers in Chinese universities as there were in 1998. A whole million extra people have been added to the workforce. Of course, there are also many more universities and many more students, and staff-student ratios have gone up through the roof in most places except XJTLU. But nonetheless, there are a lot more people who've come into the workforce and got jobs. The structural reason I'm alluding to is if you bring 1 million people in to become university teachers so quickly, they're not sociologically or intellectually going to be the same kind of animal as the people who were there before. And indeed, they're going to have an allegiance to the fact that they've got a job in the system that they didn't have before. So, you know, that's quite understandable. So regime change from intellectuals, no real push. But in that study, they showed something we find elsewhere too. We find that various groups of people, lawyers, homeowners, so on, they can mobilize for things, for political aims, but they don't generally mobilize in order to have regime change. They mobilize to have their own fair share of the action. Lawyers, I mean, you know, it sounds strange to argue this at a time when there's so many lawyers who've currently been oppressed by the system, but lawyers on the whole haven't gone out and asked for political change. They've asked just to have the regularization of their own legal profession, which is quite a reasonable request. Oh, we've gone again. And the same kind of thing is true about homeowners. Homeowners mobilize because, you know, you read a lot about homeowner demonstrations. How do they come about? What are they about? Are they homeowners against local authorities, against local government? No. Most of the time, homeowners are mobilized and take action against shonky developers who've said, come, live on this new estate, we'll have roads, we'll have shops, we'll have transport, we'll have schools, and so on. And the developers never bring these things in. And then the homeowners, understandably, they've paid a lot of money, they get really upset. So it's more self-interest than either a class movement or a movement for a greater change. And then there are studies which have gone beyond this, and again Bebe's done a bit of this and other people too, which have shown that what middle class, not everybody in the middle class is like this, but when middle class people have views about change, social and political change, the view they have is they mind the fact that inequality has grown and that people who had a fair share of the system before have lost out. So there's a big study by Marty White from Harvard, which interviewed thousands of people, which shows that actually what people care about is not that they necessarily themselves have lost out, but that, that's to say they middle class people, but that other poorer people. The degree of inequality is regarded as being more than a little unacceptable. And that's really quite a different kettle of fish to a desire for democracy. I'm going to just round up then and stop, and you can ask any questions you like, but these are my basic conclusions then. What we have here is not a series, a specific middle class. We have a range of middle classes, limited in size. The notion of middle class is actually about a discourse of change and a marker for the future. Some people have pointed out that the middle class is the anxious class, and that's clearly the case. The upper class don't care, the middle class are anxious, and often the subordinate classes are angry. And it's the management of the anger which is much more important for the regime than the anxiousness of the middle class in terms of change. So I'll stop there. This is the middle class of the late 19th century, a merchant's house in Xi'an. And if you're interested, this is the best book on the subject in the world. Copies are available in the library, and so on and so forth. Any questions?